He had forgotten the sound of his own name until her voice carried it through the thickest canopy like a prayer for the damned. He was the god of the kill, yet he found himself kneeling before the quiet mercy of her human heart. A kingdom of emerald and iron. A heartbeat that disrupts the ancient law. The slow thawing of a frozen spirit. Shadows learning to love the light. A surrender that tastes like peace. The jungle did not breathe. It pulsed, a heavy, humid rhythm that matched the beating of 1,000 hearts hidden beneath the velvet canopy of the night. Here in the heart of the emerald deep, time was not measured in hours or days, but in the slow growth of moss over ancient stone and the cyclical dance of the hunter and the prey. He sat upon the great root, a throne of gnarled wood and living vine that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations he no longer cared to remember. His skin was the color of the earth after a heavy rain, etched with scars that told the history of 1,000 battles won and 1,000 mercies denied. To the tigers, he was the shadow that moved faster than the wind. To the great serpents, he was the voice that spoke in the vibration of the ground. He was the sovereign of the wild, a being who had shed his humanity so long ago that the very concept of a soft word or a gentle touch felt like a ghost of a dream he had once had in another life. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, a perfume that usually brought him a sense of absolute control, but tonight something was different. The wind carried a new scent, something fragile and sweet, like sun-warmed skin and the dried ink of old books, a scent that did not belong in a place where the only law was survival. He tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing as he filtered through the cacophony of the jungle, the screech of a distant hawk, the rustle of a viper through the ferns until he heard it. It was a sound so small it should have been lost in the chorus of the wild, but to him it was as loud as thunder. It was the sound of a human heartbeat, rapid and uneven, skipping with the frantic energy of a creature that knew it was out of its element. He rose from his throne, his movements fluid and silent, a ghost in the darkness. He did not need to see to know where she was, the jungle told him. The trees whispered her location through the rustle of their leaves, and the ground hummed with the weight of her footsteps. She was moving toward the Obsidian Falls, a place where the water fell with enough force to crush bone, and where the shadows were deep enough to swallow a soul whole. He moved through the branches with a grace that defied his massive frame, his senses expanding to encompass her every movement. He saw her then, a small figure silhouetted against the bioluminescent glow of the fungi that clung to the damp rocks. She was wearing clothes that were torn and stained with the green blood of the forest, her hair a tangled mess of gold that caught the faint moonlight filtering through the ceiling of leaves. She looked so small, so impossibly delicate, like a porcelain doll dropped into a pit of lions. He watched her from the safety of the high boughs, his heart, that cold iron thing, stuttering for the first time in centuries. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't running in a blind panic. She was walking with a quiet, desperate dignity, her hands trembling as she touched the bark of the trees as if seeking guidance from the very spirits that wanted to devour her. He felt a strange pull in his chest, a tether of golden light that seemed to bind his spirit to hers. It was a sensation he had long ago buried under layers of animal instinct and divine indifference. He watched as she reached the edge of the falls, the spray of the water misting her face, turning her skin into a map of shimmering diamonds. She sat down on a mossy stone, her shoulders slumped, and for the first time he heard her voice. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a soft, melodic hum, a song from a world he had forgotten, a world of cradles and hearthfires and the safety of four walls. The sound of it sliced through his defenses, carving a path through the wilderness of his soul. He found himself descending, not as a predator, but as a witness to a miracle. He landed on the soft earth a few yards behind her, his weight making no sound, yet the jungle went silent in his presence. The insects stopped their chirping, and the predators in the brush slunk away, sensing the arrival of their master. She must have felt the change in the air, the sudden heavy stillness that precedes a storm, because she turned around. Her eyes were wide, the color of a summer sky just before the stars come out, and when they met his, he expected her to scream. He expected her to flee. Instead, she breathed out a single word, a name that hadn't been spoken in the tongue of men for an age. It was a name he had forgotten he owned. She didn't look at him with terror, but with a profound, aching recognition, as if she had been looking for him in her dreams her entire life. He stood frozen, the king of all he surveyed, rendered powerless by the gaze of a girl who had nothing but her own breath to protect her. The mist from the falls swirled between them, a veil of silver and shadow, and in that moment, the laws of the jungle were rewritten. He stepped forward into the faint light, his presence filling the space until the very trees seemed to lean in to listen. He saw the way her breath hitched, the way her pulse fluttered at the base of her throat like a trapped bird. He wanted to reach out, to touch the warmth of her skin, to see if she was made of the same ephemeral stuff as the moonlight, but he stayed his hand. His hands were meant for breaking, for tearing, for ruling. They were not meant for the fragility of a human girl. And yet, as she reached out her own hand, her fingers trembling but certain, he felt the first crack in the armor he had worn for eternity. Her touch, when it finally came, was not a blow, but a healing. It was the warmth of a sun he had forgotten existed, a gentle pressure against his scarred cheek that made the world around them fall away. The jungle, with all its teeth and claws, faded into a blur of green and shadow, leaving only the two of them in a circle of silence. He closed his eyes, leaning into her palm, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the sovereign of the wild felt the heavy weight of his crown begin to slip. He realized then that he didn't want to rule the beasts anymore. He wanted to be the man who deserved the look in her eyes. The water continued to roar over the falls, a constant, soothing backdrop to the new language they were discovering in the quiet space between heartbeats. He spoke then, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that vibrated through the very marrow of her bones, telling her of the shadows he had lived in and the light he had never hoped to see. She listened not just with her ears, but with her whole being, her presence a balm to the jagged edges of his spirit. They stayed there as the moon climbed higher, two vastly different worlds colliding in a soft explosion of longing and grace. He showed her the secret paths of the forest, the places where the flowers bloomed only in the presence of true love, and the hidden grottos where the water tasted like starlight. He watched her marvel at the wonders he had taken for granted, her wonder igniting a fire in his own chest that warmed the parts of him that had been frozen for so long. Every step they took together was a step away from his solitude, and a step toward a future he couldn't yet define, a future that smelled of her and felt like home. He protected her from the thorns that tried to snag her skin and the shadows that tried to steal her breath, his every instinct pivoting from the hunt to the sanctuary. He found himself gathering the softest moss for her to sleep on and the sweetest fruits for her to eat, his power channeled into the simple, profound act of caring for another. He watched her while she slept, the rise and fall of her chest the only clock he cared to follow, her peace his only ambition. In the quiet hours of the dawn, when the jungle was painted in shades of violet and gray, he would sit by her side and wonder how he had ever survived without the light she brought into his dark kingdom. He realized that his strength was nothing compared to the courage it took for her to love a monster, and his wisdom was empty compared to the truth she held in her simple, human kindness. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into a timeless blur of shared glances and whispered secrets. He taught her the songs of the birds, and she taught him the stories of her people, of the cities made of stone and the music made of strings. They built a bridge between their worlds with nothing but the tenderness of their touch and the honesty of their hearts. But the jungle was a jealous mistress, and the laws he had enforced for so long began to chafe against the new life he was building. The beasts watched from the shadows, their golden eyes reflecting a confusion that mirrored his own internal struggle. They saw their king becoming soft, his edge blunted by the presence of the human girl, and the whispers of rebellion began to stir in the undergrowth. He felt the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that hummed in the air like a taut wire, but he didn't care. He would burn the entire jungle to the ground before he let a single hair on her head be harmed. He was no longer just the ruler of the beasts. He was her protector, her lover, her anchor in a world that didn't understand the language of the heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of orange and purple, she took his hand and led him to the edge of the great plateau. Below them, the world stretched out in an endless sea of green, but far in the distance, she pointed to a faint glow on the horizon, the lights of a human village. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a fear that she would leave him for the world she belonged to, for the safety and the comfort of her own kind. He looked at her, his heart heavy with the words he couldn't say, but she only smiled, a soft, sad expression that broke him in two. She told him that she knew where she came from, but she also knew where she belonged, and as she leaned her head against his shoulder, he realized that she wasn't looking at the lights as a destination, but as a memory. She chose the shadow, she chose the wild, she chose him, and in that choice he found a redemption he didn't know he was seeking. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his body a shield against the world and his heart a promise that would never be broken. The jungle could roar, the beasts could howl, and the stars could fall from the sky, but as long as she was in his arms, he was king of something far greater than a kingdom of trees. He was the master of a love that transcended nature, a love that had turned a predator into a poet and a girl into a queen of the wild. They stayed there for a long time, watching the stars come out one by one, a map of fire in the velvet dark. He whispered her name into the wind, a sacred sound that the trees would carry forever, a testament to the girl who had tamed the untamable. He felt the hum of the earth beneath them, the steady, ancient pulse of the world, but it was nothing compared to the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart against his own. He knew there would be challenges ahead, that the wild would always try to reclaim its own, and the world of men would always fear what it couldn't control, but he also knew that they were no longer two separate entities. They were a single force, a harmony of light and shadow, of human fragility and divine strength. He looked down at her, her eyes reflecting the infinite depth of the cosmos, and he saw a future that was no longer a lonely expanse of time, but a shared journey through the beautiful, terrifying mystery of existence. He kissed her forehead, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it felt like a prayer, and in that moment the sovereign of the wild finally found his peace. The jungle around them seemed to exhale, the tension of the day dissolving into the cool, indigo embrace of the night. The beasts retreated further into the depths, leaving the king and his queen to the silence they had earned. He led her back to their sanctuary, a place where the walls were made of living flowers and the floor was a carpet of fallen stars, and as they lay down together, he felt the last of his old self wither away. He was no longer the lord of the hunt. He was a man who loved a woman, and that was a power far greater than any he had ever wielded over the beasts. The night was long and filled with the soft sounds of the forest, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't listening for danger. He was listening to the sound of her breathing, a lullaby that guided him into a sleep free of ghosts and full of the promise of a new dawn. He dreamed of a world where they could walk through the sunlight without fear, where the scars on his soul were nothing more than stories they would tell their children. He woke before the sun, watching the light slowly filter through the leaves, turning the world into a cathedral of green and gold. She was still asleep, her face peaceful in the morning light, and he felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it nearly took his breath away. He would spend every moment of his eternal life making sure that peace never left her eyes. He would be the wall between her and the darkness, the heat against the cold, the voice that whispered love in the face of the wild's indifference. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch as light as a butterfly's wing. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and when she saw him, she didn't look startled or afraid. She looked home. She reached up and pulled him down to her, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of honey and the coming day. It was a kiss that held the weight of all the years he had spent alone and all the years they would spend together, a seal on a covenant that even the gods would respect. They spent the morning wandering through the high meadows, where the grass grew tall and the air was thin and sweet. He showed her the eagles' nests and the hidden springs where the water was so clear it looked like liquid glass. He watched her laugh as a butterfly landed on her nose, a sound that he wanted to capture and keep in a jar like a precious firefly. He realized that the jungle wasn't just a place of survival anymore. It was a playground, a gallery of wonders that they were exploring together. Every tree had a story, every rock had a memory, and she was the one who was bringing them all to life. He found himself seeing his kingdom through her eyes, finding beauty in the small things he had always overlooked, the intricate pattern of a spider's web, the way the light danced on the surface of a pond, the smell of the earth after a frost. She was teaching him how to live, not just how to exist, and he was a willing student of her humanity. As the sun reached its zenith, they sat by a stream that hummed a low, constant tune. He dipped his feet into the cool water, feeling the current tug at his skin, and for the first time he felt a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with power. He was just a man sitting by a river with the woman he loved, and that was enough. He looked at her, her skin glowing with health and happiness, and he knew that he would do anything to keep that glow alive. He would fight the sun if it tried to burn her, and the rain if it tried to drown her. He was the king of the jungle, but she was the queen of his heart, and that was the only title he ever wanted to hold. The afternoon was a slow, golden crawl of shared silence and soft words. They talked about the things they would do, the places they would see, the life they would build in the heart of the wild. He promised her a house made of cedar and stone, a garden where the flowers would never fade, and a life that was as wild and beautiful as the jungle itself. She promised him her heart, her soul, and every breath she would ever take. It was a fair trade, a balance of power that made the world feel stable for the first time. But as the shadows began to lengthen, a low growl echoed through the trees, a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of a predator hunting for food, it was the sound of a challenge. He stood up, his body tensing, his animal instincts snapping back into place. He pulled her behind him, his eyes scanning the tree line for the source of the sound. Out of the darkness stepped a great black panther, his eyes glowing with a fierce, rebellious light. He was the leader of the predators, the one who had always been the most loyal to the old ways, and he was not happy with the changes he was seeing. He growled again, a sound that translated to a demand for the king to return to his nature, to cast aside the human girl and reclaim his place as the apex of the jungle. He looked at the panther, his own eyes burning with a cold, hard light. He didn't speak in growls or roars. He spoke in the language of a man who had found something worth more than power. He told the panther that his reign as a beast was over, and his reign as a protector had begun. He told him that the girl was not a weakness, but a strength, and that any threat to her was a threat to him. The panther lunged, a streak of black shadow against the green, but he was ready. He moved with a speed that the panther couldn't match, his strength amplified by the need to protect the woman he loved. They clashed in a blur of fur and muscle, a battle for the soul of the jungle. She watched from the sidelines, her heart in her throat, her hands clenched in prayer. She saw the man she loved fighting like a demon, his every move a testament to his devotion. He didn't use his claws to kill. He used his strength to subdue, to show the panther that his way was no longer the only way. He pinned the great beast to the ground, his hand around its throat, his eyes staring into its own. He didn't squeeze. He didn't tear. He simply held him there, showing him the mercy that the girl had shown him. He told the panther that there was a new law in the jungle, a law of compassion and coexistence, and that if he couldn't accept it, he was free to leave. The panther stopped struggling, the fire in his eyes fading into a reluctant respect. He let out a low whine, a submissive sound that signaled his surrender. He got up and slunk back into the shadows, his tail between his legs, and the jungle went silent once more. He turned back to her, his chest heaving, his body covered in sweat and dust. He expected her to be afraid, to see the monster he had become in the heat of the battle, but she only ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and sobbing with relief. She kissed his scars, she kissed his bruised knuckles, she kissed the fire in his eyes until it turned back into the warm, golden glow she loved. He held her close, his heart pounding against hers, and he knew that the battle was won, not just against the panther, but against the part of himself that had feared his own strength. They returned to their sanctuary, the moon rising to witness their victory. The jungle felt different now, more peaceful, as if the very trees were exhaling a sigh of relief. The old ways were gone, replaced by something new and fragile and beautiful. They lay together in the cool night air, the stars their only witnesses, and he told her that she was his courage, his reason for being, his home. She fell asleep in his arms, her breath a soft rhythm against his skin, and he stayed awake for a long time, watching the shadows dance on the walls. He knew that there would be other challenges, other panthers in the dark, but he wasn't afraid. He had her, and that was all the power he needed. The next day they began to build their home. He used his strength to move the great stones, and she used her skill to weave the vines and the branches into a structure that was both strong and beautiful. They worked side by side, their movements a dance of cooperation and love. The beasts watched from a distance, no longer challenging, but curious, seeing the king they had once feared building a place of peace. Even the panther returned not to fight, but to watch, eventually coming close enough to lie in the shade of their new home, a silent guardian of the new order. They built a fireplace where they could sit on cool nights and a porch where they could watch the sunset. They planted a garden of wild fruits and flowers, a place where the jungle and the human world met in a riot of color and scent. It was a home in every sense of the word, a sanctuary where they could be themselves without fear or judgment. As the months passed, the story of the king and the human girl spread through the jungle and even to the edges of the human world. It became a legend, a tale of a love that was stronger than nature, a love that had changed the world. Some people didn't believe it, calling it a fairy tale or a myth, but those who lived near the emerald deep knew the truth. They could see the change in the jungle, the way the animals seemed less aggressive, the way the air felt lighter and sweeter. They could hear the sound of her laughter echoing through the trees, a sound that brought a sense of hope to everyone who heard it. He grew older, his hair turning the color of the moonlight, his body slowing down but his spirit remaining as strong as ever. She aged with a grace that made him love her more every day, her beauty deepening with every year they spent together. They were happy, truly and deeply happy, in a way that few people ever are. They had found their paradise in the heart of the wild, a place where they could be free to love and be loved in return. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the stars come out, she took his hand and looked into his eyes. She told him that she had no regrets, that she would choose this life 1,000 times over. He kissed her hand, his heart full to bursting, and told her that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He looked out at the jungle, his kingdom, and saw not a place of darkness and death, but a place of light and life. He saw the trees he had protected, the animals he had ruled, and the woman he had loved, and he knew that his life had been a masterpiece. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the cedar walls of their home, and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. He was the sovereign of the wild, the protector of the human girl, the man who had found his soul in the heart of the jungle. And as the night folded around them like a velvet blanket, he knew that their story would never truly end. It would live on in the rustle of the leaves, the roar of the falls, and the beating of every heart that dared to love against the odds. The seasons began to turn in a slow, majestic wheel, each phase of the earth bringing new colors to the canopy and new depths to the love that had taken root in the soil of their shared sanctuary. When the great rains arrived, transforming the jungle into a world of silver mist and emerald shadows, he watched her with a quiet, fierce pride as she learned to navigate the changing landscape. The water fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, drumming against the broad leaves of the Titan trees and creating a chorus of 1,000 liquid voices that echoed through the valleys. He showed her how to find the hollows within the ancient trunks where the air remained dry and sweet, scented with the musk of old wood and the hidden stores of honey left by the stingless bees. They would huddle together in the half-light, the warmth of their bodies creating a private world that the storm could not touch. He would wrap his heavy, fur-lined cloak, a relic of his more primal days, around her shoulders, feeling the way she leaned into him, her head resting against the scarred breadth of his chest. In those moments, the sound of the rain was not a threat but a lullaby, a reminder that the world outside was vast and wild, but here, within the circle of his arms, she was safe. He found himself telling her the stories that the stones told, tales of the earth's cooling, and the first seeds that had split the rock to reach the sun. He spoke of the great migrations of the moon moths and the silent wars of the roots beneath the soil, sharing with her the secret history of a kingdom that had never before known a witness. She would listen with a stillness that mirrored the deep pools of the obsidian falls, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the small fire they kept burning between them. She began to teach him as well, not with words, but with the subtle gestures of her humanity. She showed him how to weave the long, supple grasses into baskets that could hold the wild berries, and how to press the petals of the blue-veined lilies into the pages of a small, leather-bound book she had carried from her old life. He watched her fingers move with a delicacy that fascinated him, a sharp contrast to the raw power of his own hands. He began to see that strength was not merely the ability to crush or to command, but the patience to create something that could be broken. His hands, once used only for the hunt, learned the soft pressure required to help her secure a vine or to offer her a drink from a hollowed gourd. The transformation was slow, a gradual thawing of the ice that had encased his heart for centuries, and every day he felt the edges of his divinity softening into something more fragile and yet more resilient. As the rains subsided and the air grew thick with the scent of blooming orchids, the jungle erupted in a riot of life. The birds returned to the high boughs, their plumage a kaleidoscope of sapphire, gold, and crimson, and their songs filled the dawn with a joy that felt new to him. He took her to the hidden glades where the air was heavy with the perfume of the night-blooming jasmine, a scent that always made her eyes go soft and dreamy. They would walk for hours, her hand tucked firmly into his, their footsteps a quiet counterpoint to the vibrant life all around them. He noticed that the predators no longer slunk away in fear when she approached. Instead, they watched from the periphery with a solemn curiosity, as if sensing the change in their master's spirit. The great cats would sometimes follow them at a distance, their golden eyes reflecting a peace they had never known under his previous, iron-fisted rule. He had become a bridge between the wild and the gentle, a living testament to the possibility of a world where the tooth and the claw were not the only law. Yet, even in this paradise, the echoes of her former life would sometimes drift in on the wind. One afternoon, while they were gathering fruit near the eastern edge of his domain, they heard the distant sound of a bell, a thin, metallic chime that belonged to the world of men. He saw the way she went still, her breath catching in her throat as she looked toward the horizon. The fear that had always sat in the back of his mind flared up, a cold, sharp pain that made him want to scoop her up and hide her in the deepest cavern where no one could ever find her. He stood tall, his muscles coiling under his skin, his eyes narrowing as he searched the tree line for any sign of intruders. But when he looked at her, he didn't see a desire to return. He saw a ghost of a memory, a flicker of the life she had left behind. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers grounding him, her gaze clear and unwavering. She told him that the sound was just a reminder of how far she had traveled to find him, a bell ringing for a girl who no longer existed. She was no longer the daughter of a village or the servant of a master. She was the companion of the wild, the one who had seen the soul of the beast and called it home. He felt the tension leave his body, replaced by a surge of love so powerful it made his knees weak. He knelt before her in the long grass, his head bowing in a gesture of absolute surrender. He wasn't just her protector, he was her devotee. He realized then that his kingdom was not the vast expanse of trees and mountains, but the small space between her heart and his. The summer brought a heat that shimmered over the plateau, a golden haze that made the world feel like a waking dream. They spent the long afternoons by the river, the water cool and clear against their skin. He would watch her swim, her movements graceful and fluid, her laughter sparkling like the sunlight on the ripples. He would sit on the bank, his shadow long and dark, a guardian of the shore. He found himself composing silent poems to her in his mind, using the language of the wind and the trees to describe the way the light caught the curve of her shoulder or the way her hair smelled of sun and rain. He had never known that he possessed the capacity for such beauty, that his mind could be a garden instead of a battlefield. He started to bring her small gifts, a perfect, unblemished pearl found in the belly of a river mussel, a stone smoothed by 1,000 years of current into the shape of a heart, a rare orchid that grew only on the highest peaks. Each gift was a silent word in a language they were building together, a language that required no voice. She would accept them with a smile that lit up his entire world, placing them in their home as if they were the treasures of a king. Their sanctuary grew more beautiful with each passing day, a reflection of the love that flourished within its walls. He had built a hearth of smooth river stones, and she had filled the corners with bundles of dried herbs that made the air smell of sage and mint. They had a bed made of the softest down and woven silks, a place where they could lose themselves in the intimacy of their connection. The nights were a time of deep, quiet discovery, as they explored the terrain of each other's bodies with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. He was amazed by the softness of her skin, the way it yielded to his touch, and she was intrigued by the strength of his limbs, the way they moved with a power that was always tempered by his love for her. Every kiss was a promise, every touch a vow, and in the darkness of their room, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of their breathing and the steady beat of their hearts, two separate lives woven into a single, unbreakable cord. As the years began to layer themselves over their existence like the rings of a great cedar, he felt the first stirrings of a new kind of awareness. He was immortal, a creature born of the jungle's ancient magic, but she was mortal, a flame that burned brightly but briefly. This realization brought with it a quiet, persistent ache, a knowledge that one day he would have to face the silence of the forest without her voice to fill it. He began to cherish every second with an intensity that was almost painful, memorizing the way she looked in every light, the sound of her sigh as she fell asleep, the feeling of her hand in his. He became more attentive to her needs, anticipating her desires before she even spoke them. He wanted to give her a lifetime of happiness in every hour they shared, to pack the centuries of his existence into the decades of hers. She seemed to sense his internal struggle, her love for him becoming a steady, grounding force that helped him navigate the shadows of his own immortality. She told him that life was not measured by its length, but by the depth of the love it contained, and that they had already lived 1,000 lifetimes in the short years they had been together. She taught him to appreciate the transience of things, the way a flower was most beautiful just before it withered, the way the sunset was most vibrant just before the dark. She showed him that the beauty of a human life lay in its fragility, and that his love for her was meaningful precisely because it was a choice he made every single day. They lived in a state of grace, a pocket of time where the laws of nature and the laws of the heart were in perfect alignment. He saw her hair begin to silver, a change he found as beautiful as the first frost on the leaves, and she saw the way his golden eyes grew deeper and more thoughtful with every passing year. They were two parts of a whole, a harmony of the eternal and the ephemeral. The jungle continued to flourish under his care, but it was a different kind of wild now, one that was guided by compassion and understanding. He had become a legendary figure, the Shadow King who lived in a house of leaves with the Woman of Light, and the stories of their love were told by the creatures of the forest to their young. He found a profound satisfaction in the legacy they were creating, a legacy not of conquest or fear, but of a peace that had been hard-won and deeply cherished. Even the oldest and most stubborn of the beasts had come to accept the change, finding a strange comfort in the presence of the human queen who had tamed their king. One winter, when the air turned sharp and the stars looked like chips of ice in the black sky, she fell ill. It was a simple cold, a common human ailment, but to him it was a terrifying reminder of her vulnerability. He stayed by her side day and night, his heavy frame curled around her small form, his hands constantly checking her temperature and offering her water. He called upon all the knowledge of the jungle, gathering the rarest roots and the most potent herbs to brew into teas that would soothe her fever. He spoke to the spirits of the air and the earth, pleading with them to spare her, to take his immortality if it would buy her another day of health. He realized then that he would trade every moment of his eternal life for one more hour of her laughter. She watched him with eyes that were tired but full of love, her hand resting on his cheek as she told him not to be afraid. She told him that she wasn't going anywhere, that her spirit was so deeply entwined with his that even death could not truly separate them. Her recovery was slow, but eventually the fever broke and the color returned to her cheeks. When she finally stepped out onto the porch again, leaning on his arm for support, the entire jungle seemed to celebrate. The birds sang with a fervor that was deafening, and the very trees seemed to lean in to catch the scent of her recovery. He felt a relief so profound that he wept, the tears falling silently onto her shoulder as he held her close. He knew then that he would never be ready to lose her, but he also knew that the fear of loss was simply the price of a love this great. They continued their life in the heart of the wild, their bond deepening with every obstacle they overcame. They saw the rise and fall of moons, the change of seasons, and the slow, steady growth of the forest. They were a part of the landscape now, a feature of the wild as permanent as the mountains and as fluid as the river. He found himself looking at the world with a sense of wonder that never faded, his heart a vessel for the love she had poured into it. He knew that the story they were writing together was one that would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of a human heart to change the destiny of a god. He was the sovereign of the wild, the ruler of the beasts, but he was first and foremost her love, her companion, her home. And as the sun began to set on another perfect day, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, he knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. He looked at her, her face a map of the life they had shared, and saw a beauty that transcended time. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, a connection that was as ancient as the earth and as fresh as the morning dew. They sat in the silence of the coming night, the jungle breathing around them, a steady, rhythmic pulse that was the backdrop to their own shared life. He felt a sense of contentment that he had never thought possible, a peace that was as deep as the roots of the world. He knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, a single heart beating in the vast, beautiful wilderness of existence. He was no longer a creature of the dark. He was a man of the light, transformed by the love of a girl who had seen the king beneath the beast. And as the stars began to appear in the velvet sky, he whispered her name once more, a prayer and a promise that the jungle would remember forever. The years continued to unfurl like the slow, deliberate blooming of a century plant, each day a petal of time that added to the fragrance of their shared existence. He found that his memory, once a vast and dusty warehouse of battles and territorial disputes, was now a vivid gallery of her smiles, the specific way she hummed when she was focused on weaving a basket, and the golden light that danced in her hair during the hour before sunset. The home they had built together became a living entity, the cedar walls absorbing the sound of their laughter, and the scent of the dried lavender she hung from the rafters to keep the mountain air sweet. He had carved a heavy table from a fallen ironwood tree, its surface polished to a mirror sheen by the friction of their hands over countless meals, and upon it she had placed the small treasures of their life, the river-smooth stones, the bleached bones of ancient birds, and the leather-bound book that now overflowed with pressed flowers and sketches of the creatures that visited their porch. He would sit by the hearth in the evenings, the fire casting long, flickering shadows against the walls, and watch her as she read to him by the light of a tallow candle. Her voice was the only music he ever truly needed, a soft, melodic thread that wove through the heavy silence of the jungle, bringing stories of distant cities and ancient kings into the heart of the wild. He realized that through her, he was reconnecting with the humanity he had discarded so long ago, finding that the parts of him he thought were dead were merely dormant, waiting for the warmth of her presence to wake them. The jungle itself seemed to sense this softening, the very air around their home vibrating with a frequency of peace that was rare in a world governed by the hunt. The great silverback gorillas, usually reclusive and stern, would sometimes bring their young to the edge of the clearing, watching with intelligent, soulful eyes as she tended to her garden of wild herbs and mountain strawberries. He saw the way she spoke to them, her voice a gentle murmur that lacked any hint of fear, and he saw the way the beasts responded, not with the submission they gave to a king, but with a quiet, mutual respect that was far more profound. He began to understand that his previous rule had been based on the strength of his grip, but her presence had taught the jungle the strength of a soft touch. This realization changed the way he moved through the world. His footsteps grew lighter, his gaze less predatory, as he began to see himself not as a master of the wild, but as its most devoted guardian. He spent hours patrolling the borders of their sanctuary, not to keep the beasts in, but to ensure that the encroaching world of men stayed at a distance. He could smell the smoke of their chimneys and hear the bite of their axes on the wind, but he made sure that no human foot ever crossed the invisible line he had drawn around their happiness. He was the wall between her and the complexities of her past, a living shield that allowed her to bloom in the safety of the green. Yet as the seasons shifted from the golden heat of summer to the crisp, crystalline silence of winter, he found himself increasingly preoccupied with the rhythm of her heart. To him, who had seen the sun rise and set for an eternity, the passage of time was a distant concept, but she was a creature of the seasons, her life a beautiful, fleeting arc against the backdrop of his immortality. He noticed the way she moved a little more slowly when the frost was heavy on the ground, the way she leaned on his arm with more weight when they climbed the steep path to the lookout point. It wasn't a burden, but a reminder of her preciousness, a call to cherish every breath she drew as if it were a rare and fragile treasure. He began to prepare for the future with a quiet, desperate intensity, planting trees that would provide fruit for decades and reinforcing the structure of their home to withstand storms he might not even be there to witness. He wanted to leave her a legacy of safety and comfort, a world that would continue to hold her gently even when his own strength was tested. But she always knew when his mind was wandering into the shadows of the future, and she would pull him back to the present with a touch of her hand or a look that said everything they needed to say. She told him that the only time that mattered was the time they were in, and that the beauty of a sunset was not diminished by the fact that it would eventually fade into night. She taught him to find joy in the smallest things, the way the dew clung to a spider's web, the taste of a sun-warmed plum, the feeling of the wind on their faces as they stood at the edge of the world. She was his anchor in the shifting tides of time, a constant reminder that life was not a destination but a journey, and that love was the only compass worth following. He found himself growing more reflective, his thoughts turning inward as he contemplated the nature of the man he had become. He looked back at his former self, the cold and distant ruler of the beasts, and felt a sense of pity for that creature. He had been powerful, yes, but he had been empty, a king with no kingdom in his heart. Now he had nothing but her, and yet he felt richer than the wealthiest emperor in the world of men. He had found a purpose that transcended the hunt and a peace that surpassed understanding. He spent his days in a state of quiet worship, his every action an offering to the woman who had saved him from himself. He would gather the softest moss for her to sit on, the sweetest water from the highest springs, and the most beautiful feathers from the forest floor to decorate her hair. He wanted her to feel like the queen she was, the sovereign of his soul and the light of his life. The beasts of the jungle continued to watch them, their presence a constant but unobtrusive background to their daily life. The great serpents would coil in the sun near their porch, their scales shimmering like liquid emeralds, and the colorful macaws would perch on the rafters, their chatter a bright and cheerful addition to the sounds of their home. It was as if the entire jungle was participating in their love, a silent witness to a miracle that had rewritten the laws of the wild. Even the ancient trees seemed to lean in, their branches weaving a canopy of protection over the small house and the two people who lived within it. He felt a deep sense of connection to everything around him, a realization that he and the girl in the jungle were all part of a single, magnificent tapestry, woven together by the threads of time and love. The nights were his favorite time, when the world was quiet and the stars were the only light. They would lie together on their bed of down and silk, the scent of the jungle drifting in through the open window, and talk about nothing and everything. He would tell her about the stars, giving them names from his own ancient language, and she would tell him about the constellations her people had seen, creating a new map of the heavens that belonged only to them. He would feel the warmth of her body against his, the steady rhythm of her heart, a lullaby that guided him into a sleep free of the ghosts of his past. He knew that their time was a gift, a brief and beautiful window in the eternity of his existence, and he was determined to make every second count. He was the sovereign of the wild, but he was also a man who loved a woman, and in that simple truth he found his greatest strength. He looked forward to the future with a sense of calm and anticipation, knowing that as long as they were together, they could face anything the world threw at them. He was no longer afraid of the shadows or the silence, for she was the light and the song that filled his life. He was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, and as the moon climbed higher in the velvet sky, he whispered a prayer of gratitude to the spirits of the wild for the gift of her love. The autumn of their years arrived not with a sudden chill, but with a deepening of the amber light that filtered through the canopy, a golden saturation that seemed to soak into the very wood of their home. He watched as the maples at the edge of the clearing turned the color of sunset, their leaves falling like spent embers onto the forest floor, and he felt a strange, beautiful melancholy settle over his spirit. She was sitting on the porch, her hands busy with a piece of embroidery that told the story of a great white stag they had seen in the mist, and he noticed how the sunlight caught the fine lines around her eyes, those delicate traces of a life lived in laughter and love. He sat at her feet, his large hand resting gently on her knee, feeling the pulse that had become the metronome of his entire existence. He thought back to the man he had been when he first found her, a creature of sharp edges and cold silences, a king who ruled by the strength of his roar and the sharpness of his claws, and he marveled at the alchemy of her heart. She had taken the leaden weight of his loneliness and turned it into a gold so pure it outshone the sun. He looked out at the jungle, which was now beginning its slow descent into the slumber of winter, and he realized that he no longer saw it as a territory to be defended, but as a garden to be shared. The great predators, once his subjects through fear, were now his brothers through a shared understanding of the sanctity of life. He saw a pair of leopards lounging on a high branch, their spots blending into the dappled shade, and he felt a nod of recognition pass between them. The wild was no longer a place of chaos to be ordered, but a symphony to be conducted, and she was the melody that gave the entire arrangement its meaning. He reached up and took her hand, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her palm, and he whispered her name, a sound that the wind caught and carried into the high boughs. She looked down at him, her smile a warm hearth in the gathering cool of the afternoon, and he saw in her eyes a depth of peace that he had spent centuries trying to find. She told him that she could feel the forest preparing for its rest, and that she felt a similar quietness settling in her own soul, a sense of completion that was as heavy and sweet as ripe fruit. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, the knowledge of her mortality, but it was no longer a jagged pain. It had become a part of their harmony, the shadow that made the light more brilliant. He began to speak to her of the long winters he had survived before she came, of the bitter cold and the endless white silence, and how he had never once felt the warmth he felt now. He realized that she had not only given him a future, but she had also redeemed his past, making the long centuries of his solitude seem like nothing more than a prelude to their first meeting. They spent the rest of the day in a slow, wandering exploration of the nearby groves, gathering the last of the hardy nuts and the sweet, frost-nipped berries that the squirrels had missed. Every step was a meditation on the beauty of the temporary, the way a single leaf could be a masterpiece before it crumbled into the earth. He found himself picking up a scarlet leaf and holding it out to her, his eyes asking her to see the wonder in its decay. She took it and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, telling him that everything that falls becomes the food for what rises, a cycle of life that he had understood as a beast but was only now beginning to feel as a man. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of plum and charcoal, they returned to their hearth, the smell of cedar smoke rising to meet the stars. He built the fire with a practiced ease, the flames licking at the dry wood and casting a cozy, dancing light across the room. They ate their simple meal in a silence that was more profound than any conversation, a communion of spirits that needed no words. He watched her as she leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing as the warmth of the fire took hold, and he felt a protectiveness that was so deep it felt like it was woven into his very bones. He would be the guardian of her dreams, the sentinel who stood between her and the encroaching dark. He knew that the world of men still existed beyond the green wall, with its wars and its noises and its restless hungers, but he also knew that it could never touch what they had built here. They were a world unto themselves, a kingdom of two where the only taxes were kisses and the only laws were kindness. He lay down beside her as the fire burned low, the embers glowing like the eyes of the beasts he once ruled, and he felt the steady, reassuring weight of her arm across his chest. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the wind in the trees carry him towards sleep, a sleep that was no longer haunted by the ghosts of the hunt, but filled with the presence of the girl who had taught him how to love. He dreamed of a time when the jungle was young and the stars were new, and in his dream, she was there, her hand in his, a constant thread of light in the tapestry of time. He woke in the early hours of the morning, when the world was at its coldest and most silent, and he felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked at her sleeping face, pale and beautiful in the moonlight, and he realized that he didn't care about his immortality anymore. If he could trade all the eons to come for the certainty of walking beside her into whatever lay beyond the veil, he would do it in a heartbeat. He was no longer a god of the wild, he was a husband of the earth, a man who had found his heaven in the heartbeat of a human girl. He reached out and touched her hair, the silver strands shimmering like spider silk, and he felt a love so vast it seemed to fill the entire room, pushing back the shadows and warming the cold night air. He knew that their story was approaching its final chapters, but he also knew that a good story never truly ends. It just changes its form, becoming a legend, a song, or a whisper in the leaves. He was content to be that whisper, to be the memory that the trees would keep long after the mountains had crumbled. He closed his eyes again, his breathing syncing with hers, and let himself drift back into the velvet embrace of the night. The morning brought a light dusting of snow, the first of the season, and he watched from the porch as the world was transformed into a realm of marble and diamonds. The jungle looked different in the white, its green depths muffled and softened, its sharp edges blunted by the frost. She came out to stand beside him, her breath puffing in the air like tiny clouds, and he saw the wonder in her eyes as she looked at the transformed landscape. She reached out and caught a snowflake on her tongue, laughing like a child, and he felt his heart swell until it ached. He gathered her into his arms, his massive frame shielding her from the biting wind, and they stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall in slow, silent spirals. He told her that he would build her a sleigh, and that he would harness the great elk to pull her through the white meadows so she could see the beauty of the winter woods. He wanted to give her every experience the world had to offer, to make sure her life was as full and vibrant as the jungle in spring. They spent the next few days in a flurry of activity, hewing wood and bending saplings to create the sleigh, while she sewed heavy blankets from the wool they had gathered and the furs he had traded for at the edge of the human village years ago. When it was finished, it was a work of art, carved with the patterns of the leaves and the tracks of the animals, a vessel of love that would carry them through the cold. He found the great elk at the salt lick, their antlers like frozen trees against the sky, and they came to him with a quiet dignity, knowing that he was their king and that his request was a sacred one. He led them back to the clearing, and when she saw the magnificent creatures harnessed to the sleigh, she let out a cry of delight that echoed through the trees. They set off across the plateau, the snow crunching beneath the runners, the wind whistling past their ears. He sat beside her, his hand on the reins, but he hardly needed them. The elk knew the paths as well as he did. They flew through the glades and over the frozen streams, the world a blur of white and silver. He saw the way her face glowed with the cold and the excitement, her eyes sparkling with a joy that made her look young again. He felt a sense of freedom he had never known before, a liberation from the heavy mantle of his own history. They were just two souls moving through a beautiful world, unbound by the past and unafraid of the future. They stopped at the edge of a high cliff where the world dropped away into a sea of white-capped trees, and they watched as the sun began to set, turning the snow into a field of pink and gold. He held her close as they watched the light fade, the stars beginning to prick through the indigo sky. He told her that he had seen many things in his long life, the birth of volcanoes, the death of empires, the shifting of the stars, but nothing was as beautiful as the way she looked at this moment. She leaned her head against his shoulder and told him that she was glad she had been lost in the jungle all those years ago, for it had led her to him. She said that she had lived a life of more beauty and meaning than any girl in her village could have dreamed of, and that she was ready for whatever came next. He felt a lump in his throat as he kissed the top of her head, his heart overflowing with a gratitude that transcended language. They returned home in the starlight, the elk moving silently through the snow, the world a cathedral of ice and shadow. He tucked her into bed that night, the fire roaring in the hearth, and he felt a peace that was as deep as the roots of the earth. He knew that the winter would be long, but they had each other, and that was all the warmth they needed. As the weeks passed, the snow grew deeper, and their lives moved into a slower, more quiet rhythm. They spent their days by the fire, reading and talking and simply being together. He found himself listening more intently to the sounds of her body, the rhythm of her breath, the beat of her heart, the soft rustle of her movements. He was memorizing her, etched every detail into his eternal mind so that she would never truly be gone. He saw the way her strength was flagging, the way her voice grew softer, but he also saw the way her spirit remained as bright and clear as a winter morning. She was a light that refused to flicker, a flame that burned with a steady, unwavering heat. He realized that she was not dying, but transitioning, becoming a part of the quiet, eternal beauty of the wild she had learned to love. He began to prepare for the end with a solemnity that was not born of grief, but of respect. He chose a spot for her at the edge of the high plateau, under the branches of the great root, the place where they had first met. He cleared away the snow and prepared the earth, lining it with the softest moss and the most fragrant cedar boughs. He wanted her to rest in the heart of the kingdom she had transformed, in a place where she could hear the falls and the wind and the songs of the birds she had loved. He didn't tell her what he was doing, but he suspected she knew, for she watched him with a look of profound understanding and love. One evening, when the moon was full and the world was bathed in a ghostly, silver light, she called him to her side. She told him that she was tired and that it was time for her to sleep. He took her in his arms, his heart breaking and mending all at once, and carried her out to the porch so she could see the stars one last time. He sat with her in the cold, his warmth a shield around her, and he whispered to her of all the things they had shared, the rains, the sun, the laughter, and the love. He told her that he would never forget her and that his heart would always belong to her, no matter how many centuries passed. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the infinite depth of the cosmos, and she told him that she would be waiting for him in the rustle of the leaves and the light of the moon. She said that she was not leaving him, but becoming a part of everything he loved, a presence that would never fade. He felt her breath grow shallow, her heart slow down, and then with a final, soft sigh, she was gone. He didn't scream or howl, he simply held her, his tears falling silently onto her silver hair. He felt a void open up in his soul, a vast and echoing silence that the jungle could never fill. But as he sat there in the moonlight, he felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a sensation that she was still there, a part of the air he breathed and the ground beneath him. He realized that she had kept her promise. She hadn't left him, she had just changed her form. He carried her to the place he had prepared, the snow crunching beneath his feet, the stars his only witnesses. He laid her down in the moss and the cedar, his hands trembling as he covered her with a blanket of fallen leaves and fresh snow. He stood there for a long time, the sovereign of the wild, his head bowed in a final, absolute surrender. He knew that his reign as a beast was truly over, and his reign as a memory had begun. He returned to their home, the silence of the house a heavy weight, but he found that he couldn't stay inside. He spent the rest of the night wandering through the forest, talking to the trees and the stones and the animals, telling them that their queen was now a part of them. He saw the way the beasts bowed their heads as he passed, a gesture of shared grief and respect. He saw the way the trees seemed to shiver, their branches reaching toward the moon as if in prayer. The entire jungle was mourning with him, a collective exhale of sorrow and love. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in the colors of her embroidery, he returned to the high plateau and sat by her side. He watched the world wake up, the birds beginning their songs, the river resuming its roar, and he felt a sense of peace begin to settle over him. He knew that he had a long road ahead of him, an eternity of solitude that would be tempered by her presence in every leaf and every shadow. He was the king of the jungle, but he was also the man who had loved a human girl, and that was a title that would never die. He reached out and touched the frozen earth, his fingers tracing the place where she lay, and he whispered her name into the wind. He knew that she heard him, and that she always would. The first thaw of the first spring without her was a sound that broke his heart into a million shimmering pieces, a symphony of drips and cracks that signaled the awakening of a world she would no longer walk within. He sat upon the great root, the ancient bark rough against his skin, and watched as the snow he had so carefully piled over her resting place began to recede, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. The silence of the winter was being replaced by the insistent chatter of the melt, the water finding its way into 1,000 tiny veins in the soil, carrying with it the promise of growth that felt like a betrayal. He wanted the world to stay frozen, to remain caught in the crystalline perfection of the moment she had left him, but the jungle did not care for his grief. It was a living, breathing creature that moved only forward, its pulse indifferent to the void that now occupied the center of his chest. He spent the early days of the thaw wandering through their home, his footsteps echoing in the spaces where her laughter used to live. He touched the table he had carved for her, his fingers tracing the faint indentations where she had leaned her weight, and he inhaled the lingering scent of lavender and cedar that still clung to the rafters. Everything in the house was a ghost, a physical manifestation of a presence that was now a part of the wind. He found her leather-bound book on the bedside table, the pages stiff with the memory of her touch, and he spent hours looking at the sketches she had made, the curve of a leaf, the eye of a hawk, the rough profile of his own face. He realized that she had seen things in him that he had never seen in himself, a beauty that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the way he looked at her. He took the book to his chest, holding it as if it were her hand, and he felt a sob rise in his throat, a raw, primal sound that he finally allowed the trees to hear. The beasts of the forest heard it too, and for the first time in their history they did not cower. The great panther, his fur sleek with the moisture of the spring air, climbed onto the porch and sat beside him, a silent sentinel of shared sorrow. They sat together as the sun climbed over the horizon, two predators who had been changed by the touch of a girl, and in the quiet companionship of the beast, he found the first thread of a new kind of strength. He knew he could not simply fade away into the shadows. He had a kingdom to guard, a legacy to protect, and a memory to keep alive. He began to tend to the garden she had started, his large, scarred hands learning the delicate art of weeding and pruning. He found that by caring for the things she had loved, he was keeping his connection to her vibrant and real. Every flower that bloomed was a message from her, every new shoot a testament to the life she had poured into the soil. He talked to the plants as he worked, telling them the stories she had told him, and he found that the sound of his own voice, once so harsh and commanding, had softened into a gentle resonance that seemed to soothe the very air. He became a gardener of the wild, a steward of the green world who saw the divine in the smallest of things. He watched as the birds returned to build their nests in the eaves of their house, their songs a reminder of the joy she had found in their presence. He left out bits of string and dried grass for them, watching as they wove his offerings into their homes, a cycle of creation that felt like a quiet prayer. The months bled into years, and the years into decades, and the jungle grew denser and more protective around the sanctuary of their love. He saw the way the trees moved to shield the house from the wind, the way the vines climbed the stone walls to create a living tapestry of leaves and flowers. He was no longer just the ruler of the beasts. He was the soul of the forest itself, a presence that was felt in every rustle of the brush and every shimmer of the light. He spent his nights under the stars, talking to the moon as if it were her face, and he found that the silence was no longer a burden. It was a space filled with her presence, a vessel for the love that had transcended the boundaries of life and death. He saw the world changing beyond the borders of his domain, the human villages growing into towns, the sounds of their industry a distant, buzzing hum on the horizon. He kept his watch, a silent guardian who ensured that the madness of the world of men never touched the peace of the emerald deep. He became a legend to the people of the valley, a story told to children about the king of the wild who had loved a human girl so much that he had become the wind that protected her. He didn't care for the stories, for his reality was far more beautiful and far more profound than any myth. He was a man who had been saved by love, a predator who had found his peace in the heart of a mortal, and he knew that his journey was far from over. He saw her hair in the silver mist of the falls, he heard her voice in the sigh of the pines, and he felt her touch in the warmth of the afternoon sun. She was everywhere, part of the very fabric of his existence, and he knew that as long as the jungle breathed, she would be with him. He grew older in the way that mountains grow older, his strength becoming more settled, his wisdom more vast. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the shifting of the stars, and the slow, majestic dance of the earth, and through it all, his love for her remained the only constant. He was a vessel for a love that was too big for a single lifetime, a love that required an eternity to fully express. He found himself sitting by her grave on the nights when the moon was full, the light turning the earth into a field of silver. He would tell her about the new things he had seen, the way the eagles had moved their nest to the high crag, the way the river had carved a new path through the canyon, the way the flowers in her garden had spread until they filled the entire clearing. He spoke of his own heart, which was no longer a heavy iron thing, but a garden of its own, full of the memories of their time together. He realized that she had given him a gift far greater than his immortality. She had given him the ability to feel, to wonder, and to love. He was the sovereign of the wild, but he was also a man who had found his home in the heartbeat of another, and in that simple truth, he found his greatest peace. He looked forward to the future with a sense of calm anticipation, knowing that every day brought him closer to the moment when their stories would finally merge into one. He was not afraid of the end, for he knew that the end was just another beginning, a transition from one form of beauty to another. He sat in the silence of the night, the jungle breathing around him, a steady, rhythmic pulse that was the backdrop to his own eternal life. He felt a sense of contentment that was as deep as the roots of the world, a peace that was as vast as the sky. He was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, and as the stars began to fade into the light of a new dawn, he whispered her name once more, a prayer and a promise that would echo through the ages. He watched as the first light of the sun touched the tops of the trees, turning the green world into a cathedral of gold, and he felt the warmth of her presence wash over him like a blessing. He was the king of the jungle, but he was first and foremost her love, her companion, her home. And in the quiet space between heartbeats, he knew that their love was the only true power in the world, a force that could change the destiny of a god and turn a monster into a man. He stood up from his place by the great root, his body feeling light and strong, his heart full of the song she had taught him. He walked back toward the house they had built together, the scent of the morning air sweet and cold, and he knew that today would be another beautiful day in the kingdom of their love. He saw a small blue flower blooming in the path, a flower that hadn't been there the day before, and he knelt to touch its petals. It was a sign, a small message from the world she was now a part of, and he felt a surge of joy that made him smile. He was not alone, he would never be alone, for she was in everything he saw and everything he felt. He was the sovereign of the wild, but he was also a man who had found his soul in the heart of a human girl, and that was the only title he ever wanted to hold. He walked through the door of their home, the light of the morning following him inside, and he began his day with a heart that was full of the light she had brought into his world. The shadows of his past were gone, replaced by the vibrant colors of the life they had shared, and he knew that his story would never truly end. It would live on in the rustle of the leaves, the roar of the falls, and the beating of every heart that dared to love against the odds. He was at peace, he was happy, and he was loved. He believed he was the master of the shadows until her light taught him that a king is only as strong as the heart he serves. To keep her forever, he would have to lose the only world he had ever known. The silent echo of a name in the wind. The earth yielding up its most precious secret. A divine throne discarded for a human grave. The final surrender of the beast to the man. A love that outlives the trees. The end of the wild, the beginning of home. The years had become a blur of green and gold, a long, shimmering ribbon of time that he wore around his soul like a mantle. He was the sovereign of the wild, a being who had forgotten the taste of fear and the sting of cold, yet he felt a new kind of frost creeping into his bones as he sat by the mound of earth that held the physical remains of the only creature who had ever truly seen him. The jungle was louder now, more vibrant, as if the very essence of her had seeped into the roots and the vines, turning the entire emerald deep into a living monument to her grace. He would sit for days in a state of suspended animation, his golden eyes fixed on the spot where the lilies grew thickest, waiting for a sign that the world hadn't simply swallowed her whole. He began to notice things that defied the laws of the wild he had once enforced with such iron certainty. The flowers that she had planted did not wither with the seasons. They glowed with a soft, bioluminescent inner light that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The birds that she had fed did not migrate. They stayed through the winters, their songs becoming more complex, more human, as if they were trying to tell him a secret in a language he was only just beginning to understand. He felt a strange pull from the earth itself, a magnetic yearning that originated not from his own heart, but from the very ground beneath him. One evening, as the moon reached its zenith and cast a silver veil over the plateau, he reached out his hand to touch the soil of her grave, and the earth didn't feel like cold dirt. It felt warm. It felt like skin. He recoiled, his instincts screaming of a magic deeper and more ancient than his own, a magic that belonged to the heart of the world itself. He began to dig, not with the desperation of a man seeking a body, but with the reverence of a seeker looking for a truth. His hands, scarred by 1,000 battles, moved the earth with a tenderness that made the very stones weep. He didn't find bone. He didn't find the silver hair he had cherished or the linen shroud he had woven. He found a root, a single glowing golden root that throbbed with the life force of the entire forest. And as he touched it, the twist of his reality was finally revealed to him. He didn't fall for a human girl. He had fallen for the soul of the jungle itself, which had taken a human shape to save its own king from the coldness of his own divinity. She had never been lost. She had been a manifestation of his own capacity for mercy, a bridge created by the emerald spirit to turn a tyrant into a guardian. He saw her then not in his memories, but in the air around him, a shimmering presence made of light and leaves and the breath of the wind. She wasn't dead. She had simply returned to the source, and she was waiting for him to make the final choice. He realized that his immortality was the only thing standing between him and the union he craved. To be with her, he would have to shed the divine power that had made him the master of the beasts. He would have to become a part of the cycle, to live and breathe and eventually fall back into the earth as she had. He stood at the edge of the great root, the power of a god humming in his veins, and he looked out at the vast kingdom he had ruled for eons. He saw the tigers and the serpents, the hawks and the panthers, and he felt a profound gratitude for the lessons they had taught him. But he also saw the small, humble house they had built, the garden she had tended, and the leather-bound book that held the sketches of a life he finally understood. He spoke to the jungle, his voice a low, melodic resonance that shook the leaves from the trees. He told the wild that he was stepping down, that his reign was over, and that he was choosing the path of the heart over the path of the claw. He felt the power begin to drain from him, a sensation of weightlessness and vulnerability that should have terrified him, but instead it felt like peace. His golden eyes dimmed into a warm, human brown, and the scars on his skin softened into the lines of a man who had lived and loved. He felt the bite of the wind and the dampness of the grass, sensations that were now sharp and real. He was no longer the sovereign, he was just a man. And as he took his final breath as a god, he felt her hand slip into his. It wasn't a ghost or a memory. It was the tangible warmth of a soul that had waited for him to find the courage to be fragile. They walked together into the heart of the forest, no longer as master and subject, but as two parts of a single harmony. The jungle didn't bow to him anymore. It welcomed him home. The legend of the Beast King faded into the whispers of the leaves, replaced by a story of two lovers who became the earth and the sky. He was finally finished with the hunt, and for the first time in an eternity, he was truly alive. They became the quiet pulse of the forest, the warmth in the soil, and the light in the shadows, a love that would never end because it had finally found its place in the circle of all things.